Senator Booker, Senator Schatz is recognized via WebEx.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Sherman, war is a failure of diplomacy, and the ending of war usually requires diplomacy. And so I want to just flag the fact that we haven't passed a State Department Reauthorization Act since 2003, so there's no real way for us to dial up or down resources or authorize new programs to meet our diplomatic objectives, to work with the Defense Department on our strategic military objectives. And so can you talk about what it would be like if Congress passed an annual State Department Reauthorization Act, as we do for the National Defense Authorization Act, and how that impacts this overall debate?
Thank you very much, Senator, and thank you for your support for diplomacy, which we always believe should be the first resort, and that any use of our military should be the last resort in solving problems. I actually have been in government at a time when there has been a state authorization bill, and it creates the contours and the deepens the authorities that we have to engage in diplomacy around the world. So we would always welcome Congress's role in that regard.
Well, you know, Senator Sullivan was a leader in getting the Coast Guard reauthorization to sort of hitch a ride on the defense authorization. I think that's something we ought to consider for the next defense authorization. Secretary Sherman, I also want to follow up on the NDAA and ask why we shouldn't just sunset every AUMF in every defense authorization. I understand military leaders being concerned about geographic and time constraints so that our enemies can work around them. But if it is a matter of course that Congress sunsets every authorization of the use of military force, and it is a matter of course, therefore, that we reconsider it and reauthorize every year, that would change the way we do our oversight and reassert our constitutional authority. So why not just sunset every AUMF on an annual basis and then force Congress to do its job on an annual basis?
I think I'll leave that to the discretion of the United States Senate, though Ms. Crass may have a comment she wants to make on that in terms of what it would mean for our military forces.
Yeah,
Feel free.
Senator, I think that there could be some challenging operational impacts of establishing a rhythm like that.
I've heard that, and I guess I want to press back a little bit because the challenging operational impacts with a rhythm like that is really the reason that we haven't even seriously considered amending or repealing either of these AUMFs in the longest period of time in American history. And so how can we address those legitimate concerns that you're sort of obliquely referring to without just abandoning our responsibility?
We support, the conversations that Deputy Secretary Sherman has been discussing in terms of executive branch and congressional conversations about how to replace, for example, the 2001 AUMF with something more narrow and specific. And we look forward to continuing those conversations with you and your colleagues.
Thank you. Secretary Sherman, as you know, the nature of war is changing with a keystroke. A foreign adversary can have a greater negative impact, even a violent impact on the United States than had they mobilized tanks and troops and airplanes. And I'm wondering how we address this new reality in the context of a statute that did not really contemplate anything other than traditional kinetic engagement. So how do we define war under the War Powers Resolution, or how do we interpret the definition of war under the War Powers Resolution in an era with cyber attacks and in an era when we know many of our adversaries are operating in the gray zone?
Yes, some of your other colleagues have raised cyberspace and its impact on both terrorist threats as well as the nature of war, so to speak. I think we are all contemplating these new issues and these new domains and arenas. Indeed, we now have a new domain in the Defense Department with Space Force. So we are always thinking about how we have to update, how we proceed in the world, given these new threats. In terms of what that means regarding law and war, I would defer to my legal counsel here about how they would view that going forward.
Go ahead.
Well, Senator, as I think you probably realize, this is an extraordinarily complex issue. Without a doubt, it's a cyber and what has been loosely defined as cyber war and how it relates to the law of armed conflict is a matter of intense discussion and examination in the interagency. Obviously, if a foreign state uses cyber in a way that amounts to a use of force, that would be an object of concern and under international law. But it is such a vastly complicated area that I, for one, would want to sit down and talk with the interagency colleagues in a studied way to address your concerns, which I think are a hearing unto themselves. Not that I'm inviting.
Sure. And two final thoughts here. What constitutes a use of force is basically the crux of the question. And the second final thought is that this is really Congress's role to define the use of force, given that there are new ways to use force that weren't contemplated under the old statute. Thank you.